Hello, Trapped in History followers. Welcome to episode 74, I think it is now. Pardon me if I get that wrong. And with me today, we're actually going to be starting my first guest with the series that I'm doing. So I'm going to have this series that's going to be about 6 different parts on YouTube and on all the other social media covering why our primary source is so damn good. And I have one of my mentors and a good friend of mine, a person that had helped me to become a much better AP European history teacher. And that is Kenneth LeSage. So Kenneth LeSage, again, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you again for taking your free time to join me again.
Robbie, it's always good to see you, and I really value what you do for the teachers and the kids. So yeah, I'm honored. Thank you.
Well, again, as like you said before it started recording, you're counting down your days here to retirement. So there's a part of me that's envious, and there's also a part of me it's not, because obviously I still love it, and I know you love teaching, but it's a bittersweet moment for sure. It's definitely your kids are going to miss you a lot for that, but I'm happy for you, and I also want to recommend to any of our listeners or YouTube viewers too that about a year and a half ago or so, way back when I first had Ken on to the podcast, we had more of a spotlight episode about his background, his journey with history, what got him into teaching AP, and he's an excellent source. He does a great deal of APSI trainings for AP European history teachers. And I think he's still going to be doing that through this summer. I don't know if he's going to continue that or not after retirement. I hope that he's able to still do that. And he's phenomenal with that. Yeah. And that's why this episode, I think anyone will appreciate as a history enthusiast. But especially if you happen to be a history teacher, I think you're going to appreciate this episode greatly, especially as an AP teacher. And that's why I brought Ken on to do the episode 2 of this series of why primary sources are so damn good. So again, episode 37, if you want to see Ken's background, Ken is an AP European history teacher along with other subjects that he's taught over his career. And he's an APSI trainer and instructor for College Board and through all that programs. And again, I'm grateful to have him on. So without further ado, Ken, if you're okay with it, let's jump right into our compelling question. And that is, why to you are primary sources so damn good?
Well, textbooks are necessary. I always like to say that textbooks are a crutch, and it's good for teachers to lean on. It's good for students to lean on. But once you need to start adding meat to the bones, primary sources is where you're going to find that the flavor, the texture in what the textbook is saying. And so you got the primary sources here that we're going to be talking about, and it's going to then layer the complexity and make what the textbook is saying coming alive. But I do want to kind of I'll probably say this again later, but I do want to say that just because we're going to share primary sources with our students doesn't mean that on our own we should not be looking at primary sources. And so I'm sure, Robbie, you're the same. You probably have in your playlist 70 different primary sources that you can use, and you probably use about 40 of them, use about half of them with your kids. But that other half that you don't use with your kids, that is how you are dropping in, you're peppering all of those fun facts you're getting from the primary sources and all of the layered intricacies, and that just adds to your dynamics as a storyteller, my dynamics as a storyteller, and yeah, I mean, teaching is a performing art, and the more primary sources we have that we can reference or even just pepper in our lectures, it only helps the kids.
It's a great point. And again, you brought this up in our first episode together about how teaching is an art. Like, there is a storytelling aspect to it. And one of those questions early on in that first discussion we had was, why were stories so important? And what I like about this topic now is that I think even though primary sources could obviously be biased and they could have short, or things about them that are not ideal, it's also that non-perfect kind of status of them that also makes them interesting, especially when you're doing strategies like Hippie, when you're trying to figure out biases and intended audiences and purposes. It's really interesting to do those. And to me, it only enhances storytelling. And I think you would agree with me on this too, Ken, is that you and I doing this episode, I don't want this to come off as degrading secondary sources, because I do believe that you and I are, and we can do a whole different series on that later, we both strongly support those as well. And I often tell students it's a lot like a peanut M&M. Many times secondary sources are embedded with a lot of primary sources inside of them. That's why one of the articles I did for preparation for this podcast was a critical one about teachers like you and I that may overly rely on primary sources as a standalone instruction without any lecture or anything like that. And you can get yourself into some trouble. And I think that's one of those things where you and I are obviously not degrading or reducing the importance of secondary sources. We just happen to be focusing on this now. But yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think it goes so well with what you had said previously.
Yeah, and that idea of you've got the primary source, you got the secondary source, and then we got to throw in those tertiary sources as well. And as classroom teachers, it'd be nice if we had the time, but have the kids write a DBQ so that they could see what it is like to take something that is this big and then condense it down to something that is manageable, but still holds the truth of what the original intent was.
Yeah, exactly. And again, if you can pull that off, and I know you and I have seen several AP teachers on the AP European History Facebook group that have attempted that. There are some teachers, a new one I just met a few days ago, that he mainly teaches strictly through DBQs. Like that's the main activities he does, and he tries to kind of get these bigger stories in there. And I look forward to talking to him soon on the podcast just to see how in the world does he do that.
Yeah.
It's like I've shared with you before, Chris Houston, he does all the content earlier in the year, like at that first like 9 to 10, 12 weeks. And then the rest of the year is all more like activity-based, instruction-based. So every teacher has their niche. And I think that that's what's so interesting about having conversations with teachers like you and others is just to kind of see how differently primary sources can be used. Like you and I could take the same exact one that we both love using, and there might be a completely different style. But the important thing is, and you've always said this to me, and it was one of the best pieces of advice, and that is that comparison is the thief of joy. You reminded me of that multiple times. And it's one of those things where I like the freedom. I think you would recommend this too, is that when you have a primary source like the ones you're going to show today, don't feel as though you have to do it exactly the way that you show it, but find the way that works for you that is the best for your version of storytelling, your teaching style. Because you know as well as I do, when you try to teach what someone else has created solely by that, there's not as much enthusiasm there. There's not as much like fervor there. I think there has to be that original aspect that kind of really connects you with it.
Yeah, and that you're speaking wisdom and truth there, Robbie, in regards to you got to make it your own. I've been at this gig teaching now for 33 years, and I've been teaching AP Euro for well over 24 years. And I still, to this day, I'm tweaking lessons the morning before or during lunch to make it better for after lunch. And so you've got to just, if it's not interesting to you, it's not interesting to the kids. And so I just got to make sure that it makes sense to me and it's alive for me. And, in prepping for talking to you, you had asked, how has my relationship with primary sources changed?
Mm-hmm.
And is it a good time to say that?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Go ahead.
And so for me in the past, again, going back, 30 years ago, it was, hey, today we are going to do a primary source. Is everybody ready? Okay, what is a primary source? How's that different from a secondary source? And here's this huge primary source, and we're going to read it. And now it's almost daily integration. And instead of having huge passages, yes, there are times for that. What about just having 2 sentences of Erasmus saying something about you venerate the saints? And like, okay, let's go ahead and talk about how can you reform and so on. And so for me, again, going back to what you had said, Robbie, about making it your own. So for me, what I do is I just completely integrate it. And then I've learned so again, going back 30 years ago, Here's a primary source. I'm going to read it out loud to you. Let's have you write about it. And now, yes, the first couple of primary sources, I'll go ahead and read it out loud because the sentences are long, being translated from Italian Renaissance into the modern day. And so the syntax is different. And so I know when to pause and have the kids discuss. But now it is a whole lot of, okay, I've just read this. Here's my guiding question for this particular primary source. And I want you to think about it. I want you to process it, jot down a couple of ideas. Okay, now turn to talk to your elbow partner. Then my kids are in pods. And so the two elbow partners, they have two other people at their pod. And then I'm going to cold call on one pod. So make sure that everybody knows a really good answer. And so then I'm building up that confidence of getting to be comfortable with primary sources, just integrate it pretty much every day.
And I like how you introduced it to them in I guess a less intimidating way at the beginning of the year, where you can put them with a partner or like a pod. I remember you introduced us to that concept in training before as a way to sort of build that context and to build the confidence over time. Because like you know as well as I do, by May 5th, whenever the exam is, they have to be able to know how to do these things on their own and how to discuss them. But and again, in the past, I've been more of the type of throwing them in the deep end pretty early and not doing a lot of group work or partner work. But I think there is extreme value in doing that, especially early on when you're trying to lay the foundation of that. And I know I brought this up in the past, but whenever you're talking about hiding the vegetables in the macaroni and cheese, which I had to work that line in here somewhere, I think it is easier if you've been able to build that culture within your students in a kind of a positive way. You're also, and again, you know, my teaching style is very debate based and Socratic method one. And I don't even think about even doing the pods or a partner. That's only going to build a little bit more rapport in your room, and then hopefully reflecting on those bigger discussions later. So I really appreciate that outlook. And I think introducing the students to primary sources in smaller parts, they, you know, the way that you referenced the ravenous earlier, it kind of reminds me of the way I use Kipling's White Man's Burden. So I don't show the whole poem, but I show like 3 or 4 lines of the poem. And then we talked about how would this reflect if you're an African audience?
Yeah.
How would you take, you know, that particular line there, like half child, half devil, like that line? Like, what are Europeans supposed to think of that? What are, if Africans were to read that or hear that, what would they think about that? So it's one of those things where, like you said, you don't have to give them. I always used to reference the entire Declaration of Independence. We don't have to have them read the best breakup letter in human history.
Yeah.
We just, but you can do it in excerpts. And it's one of those things where I've always found interesting is that my use of primary sources has gotten smaller. I guess my first organic question I have for you, Ken, if you're okay with this before we move on, and that is for maybe a devil's advocate, what if a teacher were to say to you, well, what if I chop too much off of the source? And by doing that, I may ruin the context of it. I may enable kids to take out the source. I guess, how do you do it in a way that doesn't ruin the credibility or the context of the source itself?
That is, yeah, a double-edged sword, loaded question.
Yeah.
Because we as teachers, whether we're AP teachers, on level, remedial teachers, we have to mix content with skills. And when we're teaching the kids how to analyze a primary source, we're leaning heavily for that 10, 20 minutes onto the skill portion. And I think that the little mini lecture that a teacher gives for 5 minutes before moving into that particular primary source will allow the kids to know the context. And then I think all of us out there, we tend to always throw in a caveat of we're only looking at it from the point of view of a reformer in 1517 as opposed to a theologian from some other time period.
Yeah.
And so I think I think our setup for that 5 minutes before we move into the primary source, to me, I think that if the classroom teacher knows how to present the context that is reinterpreting what was read in the textbook, that the kids have a little bit of background, and then boom, then we're good to go.
And again, maybe that spirals back, and if you would agree, to that art of storytelling. Do you think that's where, as you're getting more experience as a teacher, I know whenever you're first starting, it could be quite intimidating. I don't know if you remember when you first started way back when, on how intimidating it might have felt to do the storytelling part. But I do remember. So if you do think about it, if you kind of keep that sort of narrative context part about 5 minutes, you kind of give yourself a little bit of room, and you're trying to find a way to give them at least enough an idea. And when you mentioned about the reformer earlier, it kind of reminds me of the way that I try to introduce Flora Tristan. Like whenever I'm doing the Industrial Revolution, I try to bring her up as a French socialist reformer. It's a female. Let's look at this tiny paragraph for 3 or 4 sentences, what she's writing here. And I like that. And again, you bring up a great point earlier too, is that another balance that teachers or the tightrope we're walking on here is, you want to show primary sources, but we have these skills that we have to embed and have to be able to teach. And I think that's why I like so much that the way you train teachers like me is to try to organically like weave those skills in and spiral them in as you're going. They don't have to be like a separate, segregated sort of template or thing that you're using. You don't have to make it so formal, make it much more of a natural process. So I like that. And I think that might be a great answer to our question there, is just being very cognizant about what you're saying for context before the primary source, and then staying true to what skill are you trying to show without speaking out of turn of the person. Like for me, I always feel this weird sense of supernatural honor to the dead person. It sounds weird, but it's like, well, I don't want to misrepresent what Flora Tristan said in take context, but sometimes I will say, is it possible they could have meant this as well? Not that they did, but I always say, do you see how something on Twitter that's how many characters? 120 something characters is what it is. You can see why something like that could be taken out of context. And that's kind of what I do at the beginning of the year. Sometimes I'll show them some tweets and then ask them, how could this be taken out of context? Just to prove to them how to be careful about reading sources and looking at that. But me and you would never expect them to go read sources on a master's level in history. They're not going to be going to the archives or anything like that. So we have to do it in a very kind of strategic way. If you're okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next topic, if you're all right with that.
Yeah.
And kind of on this, it still kind of sticks with the classroom part. In terms of AP teaching, what do primary sources do that you think, because you mentioned this at the beginning of the podcast, is how important, of course, you think textbooks can be. What is it that you think primary sources can do that a textbook may not demonstrate? Although I know textbooks have primary sources embedded in them, but sometimes I like using it as a reference and as a guide, but I don't often have the textbooks out on their desk at a regular basis. So therefore, I ask you, these primary sources that me and you find in our careers, that we have 60, 70 of them total, what do you think that they all do or potentially do that our textbooks just may not be able to do?
So interesting. Again, this going back and forth that every teacher needs to make her classroom work for her. And this idea that I tell my kids, you got to bring your textbook every day, because we are going to be looking at maps. But what I find, I don't know, it's kind of like magic, is that it's all right, everybody, let's turn to page 555. All right, let's go ahead. And, Robbie, I need you to read this, those 4 sentences right there. And then, so everybody's there, you read the 4 sentences. And then I say, all right, come up and grab this primary source and take a look at what the textbook just said. Now let's go ahead and, take a look at this map that's showing the change over Alsace and Lorraine or whatever it might be. And going ahead and showing the kids almost how a historian thinks. How did the textbook author take this stack of primary sources and then move it over to the laundry list that is the textbook? And so then I just love to do that with the kids, that I can go ahead and say, see all of this primary source information. How can we make it digestible to you, the student? And I always remind the kids, and from the Western Kentucky APSI that we did together, that AP Euro tends to be the first AP class that students take. And so then I like to have that crutch of the textbook that they can lean on. And then I say, okay, let's go ahead and start scaffolding some really interesting stories, colors, layers onto what it does. And so, yeah.
Wait, so I'm curious, do your students take their textbooks home, or do they keep them in your classroom?
My on-level kids, it's a class set of books in the room. My AP
Okay.
kids, I try to do what could be considered a flipped classroom. So they know they
Okay.
need to read about the Northern Renaissance for class tomorrow. And then when we come into class tomorrow, then we're going to do a deep dive into 2 different things or 3 different things on the Northern Renaissance. And in the middle, embedded into something, we'll go ahead on one of those parts, we'll go ahead and be incorporating skills as well.
Mhm. Well, that's wonderful. You know, you brought up something there I didn't even think about before we started the show, and I was doing the planning and the research. I had just bought this book yesterday, and when you brought it up earlier and how you use your textbooks in conjunction with class and primary sources, you brought up like the importance of maps. I know the picture is a little pixelated, but I just bought this book called The Power of Geography. It's more from a modern day perspective, but he does references back into the past. And I think it's a fascinating point that you brought that up, because you can show kids how primary sources also relate to physically the geography there too. You know, a very common reference that I think historical enthusiasts, not just teachers, would understand is like the printing press. You know, in AP, as you know, there's lots of different sources of maps of where all the printing centers were. Do you remember those? Those like old maps of like, and it always ask students is, why are they mostly located in Central Europe? Why are they around the Holy Roman Empire? And again, you go back to Gutenberg and where he is and where it starts at, and you can kind of get an idea of like where things start at. They kind of spawn there, and then they kind of spread out. And we could talk about how the Renaissance in Northern and Italian is tied into that, and how that spreads over time through the conduit of those. It's very fascinating, because I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's a great way to look at using a textbook and the primary sources in it. Or let's just say if I have one like the printing press, well, then they could use the map of Europe at the time in the 1500s or 1400s, and then use those in conjunction. I like that. I think that's great to look at. If you're okay with that, I think that's a great transition. Go ahead, Ken.
So that I just want to shout out to that book. I've got the same book, different cover though. And for those teachers out there who want to know, how can you start integrating stories? How can you start integrating just organically, just again, peppering your class and bringing it alive? A book like that, if you're, again, just open up to the 7th map and just go ahead and read about that. If you're teaching, I think that one has like the Pulsar map in it from Rome, and it's like, you know, I don't know, 30 feet long. Yeah, there you go. So yeah, that one there. And so yeah, you can open up to any, that's the cover I have. You can open up to any one of the chapters, and they're standalone chapters. And so I just encourage all of you out there to, I know another one of your guests is a real, Mr. North is really big on books. And so, I'll push that book as well.
That's actually one of the reasons I'm trying to show some of those. He's kind of inspired me to kind of bring up, and something I've always appreciated about meeting other teachers is that other teachers always have some type of readings and books that they rely on. Like, remember, you had recommended me to read The Swerve, I think the last time we were in training together. And I'm glad I read that too, because it kind of added more context into the Renaissance time period in that part. I really liked it. So that's great. And again, completely agree with you. And again, I try to show those visuals for anybody that's on YouTube watching. You have this one. You also have the newer cover, which is the one that I got here, has been updated. But it's these kind of books there that, even though they sway more modern, they have great lessons in there over history. And I don't know. I think this is one of those times where I think, Ken, you know that I do a form of note taking called Pirates, but I think I got to remember to use what I know a lot of people use Sprite. So I think to remember to use the Geo part. I always forget about Geo Sprite or Geo Pirates. So I can't overlook next year as a teacher to really try to weave in geography more often. And I think students would dread it a lot less if it was more organically like brought into the narrative.
So let me just go ahead and throw it out there. Just 3 words for you to say, and I don't know, write it up on your board so you don't forget. The why of where.
Oh yeah, it's great.
And in fact, when you're talking about that printing press map, that literally the title of the map I give it is the why of where. Let's go ahead and so I am more, I kind of got into teaching as a result of geography, as opposed to history. And so my classes probably have more of a leaning of geography than your class would. Not that they could pass the Hug exam, but I think that I probably have the why of where in there a lot more. Okay, so sorry about the sidebar. So
no, hey, it's completely fine. I like the sidebars. It's all good. And again, you and I had just talked about that question. I think I'm going to transition into this one at this point now. What does it actually look like when a student is thinking like a historian? And this is one of those times where for people like you and I that try to weave in these skills, teaching AP has completely changed the way I teach my regular college prep classes. Like I actually use Hippie in all my classes, although I know it's only really required. It's not required by the standards of Kentucky, but if you look at our inquiry-based standards, and a lot of states are going to that inquiry-based, they work so well. Like Hippie fits almost exactly with sourcing and contextualization and all these skills. So for me, I don't know how you are. My answer for this, Ken, to kind of give you a little bit of a break on that part, it's not putting you on the seat all the time, is that for me, thinking like a historian is being able to do things like to contextualize the source of document, to see the historical situation, the intended audience, the point of view of the author or the artist or whatever it might be, and the purpose of it, and the why, of course, too. I think when you're able to do those and maybe even corroborate evidence together and find continuity or change, I think then you're thinking like a historian. I don't mean to sound like a college board like worker. I'm not trying to say that because I've kind of mentioned all those things. But to me, I think if you're doing that, you're thinking more like a historian. And that's ultimately what I would love my students to be able to do. Even though most of them do not want to be a historian, I still think there's merit in thinking like one. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Ditto. I was going to say exactly what you said. So let's double check, right? So Hippie, historical context, and then you got the intended audience, point of view, purpose, and then you always have to have the why. Why is that important? Yep. And so I'm exactly like you, Robbie. If my students can take a look at the intended audience on their own, for me, the light bulb moment for me, I'm like, yes, it was a good day. It was a good class, is when I hear with my teacher here, and I hear somebody in their pod saying, well, of course he would say that because he is, he's British and it's during the continental system. So obviously he's going to say that against Napoleon. And so when I hear that in the background, I'm like, yes. So that's what we want them to do. And then I don't know how many of you teachers out there do this, but trying to bring relevancy to class, I always, at some point within the first couple of days, first week or so of class, I always throw up careers in geography or careers in history. How is geography seen in everyday life? How is history seen in everyday life? And, for history, it boils down to argumentation. Gone are your days of saying, because he's an idiot. No, yep. You got to say what one side's going to say, but let me go ahead and give you body blows and give you all of the reasons why my side is correct. So,
there's I can't remember if you were the one to introduce me to this, but one of my good friends that teaches with me, he always shows his AP students this early activity the first week or so, and it's called like fight in the lunchroom. Have you ever heard of this activity before? No. But it's also an interesting one to teach with some of the aspects of a Hippie. Because basically it's like a very, very short synopsis story of like there's a fight in the lunchroom, which sometimes happens at high schools, that kind of thing. But let's just say, in theory, I always tell the students, if a student runs down and they run up to you and say, there was a fight in the lunchroom, it was a great fight. It was a really good fight. Now, a lot of times, and I tell the kids, I think organically a lot of them already do Hippie in reactions, because I say, if you had to come up with questions, like what would you ask this student, since you were not there to see it? What would you ask them? Well, they might ask, okay, was it really a good fight? And they might ask them, one of the kids brings up, every year it makes me so proud. One of the kids goes, well, shouldn't it depend on who's telling you it was a good fight? I was like, yeah, because to them, a shoving match might be considered a good fight, or something like that. So it's just one of those things where it kind of gets them thinking about the intended audience. Like, okay, they're telling you. Why are they telling you? Why are they telling other students? Why are they recording it? What I mean, what constitutes it as good or bad? Why do they care if it was good or bad? So it is an interesting activity. I want to share that with you later. It's a very short thing to do, but it is one of those things that's an interesting one to show students that, hey, it has a little bit of drama to it, which I like a little bit of that. It has a little bit of the drama, but it has like this thing that could easily happen in the daily school day. We deter it from happening. But then if you take it and say, okay, now do the hippie stuff in a basic conversation like a seminar over that, well, look, you just proved to yourself that you can do it. So don't ever tell me this year, I can't do it. I've never done this before, because you're a liar. Like, you have done it. You've just done it with like something else. And that's one of those times where when I think of activities like that, I think of the vegetables and the mac and cheese, like kind of statement. I think that you could do that like an activity. And at the very end, you can show the kids on the board, you actually just did these. Like the last community seminar I did, after it was over, I put up epistemology and metaphysics and all these words that would have scared them to see those. And I said, you actually just did these topics. You don't realize it, but you actually did. And I just kind of want to know what you think of that. Is us as teachers, if we've had activities like that, even though it's not about history, could you do an activity like that that kind of sets the foundation for using those skills later? Do you think that's still appropriate, or is that dumbing it down too much?
No, it is not dumbing it down in the slightest. So take a look at how the band director does what she does. Take a look at how the basketball coach does what he does. And you always have to start off low, work your way high. But the example you gave about the fight, this is something that you do, I do. I talk about in my APSIs. I know other teachers do it. This is a heavy lifting class. So let's go ahead and start off with fun examples of there was a fight in the cafeteria. There's one that I use about causation, and it's about a burglar. All right. So what caused the burglary? What's the effects of the burglary? It's not academic. All it's going to do is take up, less than 8 minutes in your class. And the kids now have this idea of, okay, it's a good fight because of this. It's a bad fight. Okay, no, wait, it is, let's take a look at the historical context. It happened in the lunchroom. Why didn't it happen in the weight room? And so then you get the kids doing that. And then I just love the way. And so there's you and I are on the same wavelength on some of these things. I like at the very end, like you do, pull back the curtain and show the kids, you thought that the wizard was scary. Look, you just did everything yourself.
Yeah, I love that. Completely agree with you. Could not put it. And I do remember the burglar activity. We did that in training with you. That was another great way. It's like you said, and I forgot to bring that up, is the time part. This doesn't have to take that much time in your class. And some of our listeners maybe even have a blog class. Unfortunately, where I teach at, it seems like through the years, we just keep subtracting more and more time from the classroom. Like, I went from 54 minutes to 50 to 45, now to 35. So in the last 2 years, I have 35-minute classes every day. You talk about getting to your point earlier. So when you say about using shorter sources, that is music to my ears. There's no time for that with RTI time and all these other things that you have to have legally. And I get it. So you have to use your time wisely. And I think that's the advice you're giving helps teachers like me that are consistently losing more time of instruction. So then you got to make the most of those moments, especially if I feel like you're doing it early on in the year to set a foundation. If that makes it a lot less straining for the students as the year goes, it is worth it. It's worth that 10-minute of sacrifice on that one day. And it's kind of a fun activity that they always remember. Like, I always do the Walpurga witchcraft thing at the beginning of the year, and they never forget that. I could bring up her name tomorrow, and they would remember, hey, here's the woman that had lustful intercourse with her, like Hans the farmer guy. Like, they remember inappropriate stuff, but they'll never forget, like, why was she burned unethically? Why does that time period in the 1600s? What does that event say about witchcraft in European history at that time, and the witch trials? Because the kids where we teach, especially in Kentucky, even though we're not on the East Coast, they think all witchcraft is just Salem. It's got to
Yeah.
be Salem. It's got to be the witch trials, but they don't realize a lot of this started in the European parts
Yeah.
first, and then I
Yeah.
trickled on
Yeah.
over.
Like,
So it doesn't
yeah,
have to be a Monty Python reference, but it is a great window to slide in a nice Monty Python clip if you really wanted to.
yeah, I like that,
But
the opening sentence of kindly questioning and torture.
yes, I love it. I love it. 'Cause I think it was one of the old like DBQs, right? I want to say it was
Yeah.
on an older DBQ set. It's one of my that actually goes down on my episode that I did on the first one that started this series. That's the one I shared.
Yeah.
Writing is my favorite written source. Other than this one that I think I shared with you about Total War, it's
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah. I used that in
Italian
the past. Yeah.
yeah. So for that one, I can't think of a better definition on the reasoning for him using to do total war. And as you know, is what we're seeing now with Iran, all those other things. We're not far away from total war again. Like things like that could be threatened still, and all this kind of stuff. So we see all that. If you're okay, Ken, just to kind of keep on going here, as I know you have some great sources you want to share too. So I don't want to take up even more time. But what is the most common mistake or misunderstanding that teachers have about using primary sources?
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and make that plural because I think that I, as a teacher, have made many mistakes over the years. And I would say that my most common mistake is that I do the thinking for the kids. And so let's go ahead and let's put up the two Reformation pictures. So for those of you that cannot see, I've got a worksheet that I give to my students, and I have questions that go with it to help guide the kids. And also by putting questions with the primary source with these images, one of Luther and one of the Pope, um, um, then by putting those questions on there, it guides the students, but it also gives me guardrails. It gives me bumpers down the bowling lane that I won't go too far, that I can go ahead and ask the question, then I can just zip it and let the kids think for a minute, write down an idea, turn and talk to their friends, and the like. So for me, a big mistake is I do the thinking for them. In the past, I think I might have, and I think that there are teachers out there that just drop the students into a source. And you sent me, Robbie, last week that that JSTAR article.
Oh, the
by,
JSTOR one, yeah.
Yeah, by Nicole Donahue. And she said in that article that you sent me exactly that teachers drop students into a source saying, analyze this. And again, getting back to the textbooks, let's go ahead and use the textbook as a good foundation. The kids read that the night before. Now let me come in and make sure they understand it, make sure that I'm putting it in a clear way. Okay, now that we have that foundational knowledge, both through the reading and through the lecture, the notes they took, now let's go ahead and present them with this source. So I'm not dropping them into something and saying, analyze this. I think another problem that teachers have is, like I said earlier, I've changed how I view primary sources, and they used to be one-off. All right, here we go. We're going to read a primary source today. Remember, we read one back in February. All right, well, we're going to do one again. So no. It's gotta be organic, and it's got to be something that we fold into our daily lessons. And then this idea of, if we do the thinking for them, and then the happy medium between I'm doing the thinking for them and me dropping them in saying, analyze it, I think are these questions that I have, where I just flat out say, we're going to look at this picture of Luther having the devil hold his hand and whisper in his ear. And we're going to talk about what is the intended format. I'm sorry, who is the intended audience. And we're going to focus on format. If this was written, what would it look like? This is drawing, therefore Can the illiterate, can the poor have access to it? So yeah, I think that those are my 4 common teacher mistakes that I have fallen into in the
Well,
past.
I have one follow-up for you just to kind of give you like a scenario. So if I were to use this assignment, and again, especially on your point where you said doing the thinking for them, I am definitely guilty of that. That's probably one of the things I am the most guilty of. So I'm so relieved that you said that. The first question that you have, the one that you just talked about, how does the format of an illustration help get the author's message across? Now, again, this would be earlier in the year in that first unit that's on there. I could see my students asking me out loud if they were like doing this on their own, like under a timer or just thinking, man, they may ask me, Mr. Malcolmson, what do you mean by format of that? Now, you just described it with me, like you the drawing, it's not a written source. But do you tell them that, like the way that you just presented it to us, or do you let them, like, I guess what I'm saying is, if they were to ask me or another teacher out loud, what do you mean by format of an illustration? What do I tell them there that's not also ruining the thinking for them? Like, do I just straight out tell them, well, it's a drawing, it's not a paragraph? For me, I would love for them to infer that. But I guess how would you advise me and other teachers to help a student that has a question about the first one without doing that thinking for them?
So format, I tell the kids, is simply how is it presented? So if you are going to write in a diary, are you going to be more truthful than if you are standing on a street corner, standing on a lunch table, yelling things out? A sermon is going to be a particular format, which is different than a private letter. And maybe you can put together a real quick scenario with there was a good fight in the lunchroom and somebody's telling you about it. Somebody else recorded it. Somebody else spray painted graffiti on the bathroom stall about it. Each of those formats is going to present the fight in the lunchroom in a different way. If
It's true.
this devil whispering into Luther's ear while he's holding his hand, what if a Catholic priest was giving that sermon? What would that look like, as opposed to Luther laying on Sigmund Freud's couch saying, they're beating up on me. Listen to the terrible things they're saying about me. And so if Luther is talking to his therapist about the image, the format is going to completely change. And to me, it is a way for the kid on the DBQ to get the hippie point. They are allowed to talk about format. That is a way. It's in the course and exam description, even though it's not part of the word hippie. It is in the course and exam description talking about format. And so for me, I like format because of the idea that the unintelligent, I apologize for that, the illiterate are able to understand that first Luther whispering in the devil whispering in Luther's ear. And then I throw them the caricature of the papacy and the sale of indulgences, the woodcut from the Reformation. That's the other picture on the worksheet I give the kids. And there ain't an average person out there in the 1530s who could interpret that thing. It is just a small group of people of, oh my gosh, this means that, that means this. The allegories on this thing is now all of a sudden you can see that even though it's an illustration, it's not meant for everybody to be able to understand. There are some things, you can imply that that's the Pope, kind of using bathroom humor with high school kids, with teenagers. And so, his bare butt is sitting on an indulgence. And so an indulgence is worth wiping your butt with, and so there's some crass things, how like in their English class, your teacher taught you that this line was meant for the kind of the working class people in the front row of the Globe Theater. But then after that, the dialogue gets to be a little bit heavier. And so, yeah, that wiping your butt with an indulgence, that's meant for the people who are paying a penny for the seat.
Yeah, that's powerful. And again, it's another effective way to use primary sources together from, like, I guess, two different points of view there. And look how streamlined the assignment is. Like, this is not something that would necessarily take an entire blog class or even an entire skinny to do that. And having like the little reference, the quoted reference on there about what, in the jaws of hell, like just adding little things like that. And I didn't even think about format. Like, I know it's in the course guide, but I think I've taken the rubric too literally. And I think being able to have the flexibility to define and describe the importance of a format of something, I think is extremely important. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and then also notice you have to have that. Therefore, the meaning of this cartoon is, and then again, that is, I put that on there again because I tend to do the thinking for the kids if I allow myself. And so I literally put up bumpers for myself and say, okay, you guys, you're going to answer that right now. And then walk up and down the rows. Or another thing that I do is that I have the pod. So there's 3 or 4 kids in a pod and they each read. And then I say, okay, pick the best one. And let's say that little Timmy had the best one, but little Timmy doesn't want to talk out loud. All right. So I'll let, Big Bad Scott read for little Timmy. And that way Timmy gets acknowledged for his good work without being embarrassed to have to read aloud. So
that's a great point. I love the bumpers on there too. It's a good one. And I like your advice. You would think someone like me that really admires and respects questioning in my teaching style. I like how one of your solutions, without saying it explicitly, was, as the student asks you questions about format, I can answer their question with more questions. So I can use questions as a way to scaffold or kind of prompt and cue them in a way that doesn't do the thinking for them, but I'm getting them to think in a more of a broke down way to kind of end up putting it away. But that's a great way to look at that. And I like the use of, like, therefore the meaning of the cartoon, because it's a way for you. And for any new teacher, let's just say if you're a new teacher in AP or you're early on in your career, I know a significant stress that I hear from a lot of new teachers, and I'm sure you've heard this for years, Ken, is the pacing. It's the overall, can I even get the content finished? That was my number one concern for those first couple of years. And I think that's where we can get also a terrible habit of maybe doing the thinking for them, because we feel like we have to go, and God forbid I don't get Unit 9 done in time or something like that. But you kind of learn as you go through the years that the substance, I think, is more important than just covering the content, because you can cover the content and it may mean nothing at the end of the year. They won't have the skills, and they wouldn't have used them on an organic level to where they could just naturally use them because we were too focused on just getting the content done. That's great. I'll go ahead and take that one off the screen, but I thought that was an excellent example, Kenneth, on that one. I'll go ahead and back to that original question there on this one. Is there any other doc you wanted to use for this particular question? Because I thought that was great. Definitely a common mistake for teachers is the examples that you gave. I just want to make sure before I move on, I didn't cut you off on any other topic.
I think I covered that in depth, so thank you.
Okay. All right, so we'll move over to this one. This time we're just going to turn the table a little bit. And what's the most common mistake that students make when they are analyzing or wrestling with a primary source?
They summarize instead of analyzing. So that Reformation one, again, with the forcing the kids to answer the question there at the end. And so by me saying what was exaggerated, why might that be exaggerated? And so if you want to put those Reformation ones back up, and so I specifically flat out say, what is being exaggerated? Why is that being exaggerated? And so then that's forcing the kids to analyze instead of just summarize. And then again, therefore the meaning of the cartoon is, and so they're not going to say, Luther listens to the devil. No, that's just summarizing the image. But by asking those guiding questions, you're forcing the kids to move away from the away from that. Can you throw up the Castiglione?
Absolutely. Yeah. There we go.
So,
and then we're on the first page right now.
Yeah. So here is a excerpt from Castiglione, the Book of the Courtier. I like to use this in my AP European history class because the Renaissance is the first chapter that I cover, and then the Reformation is the second. So I go out of order of the course and exam description. I do Renaissance, Reformation, then exploration. And so they're getting primary sources probably on day 4 or 5 in my class. We're already beginning to analyze primary sources. And so on something like Castiglione, then I find a problem is that kids are judging the past through suburban America 2026 lenses. And this one here about women being of gentle birth and anything that is manly, she needs to avoid. A woman who lacks beauty lacks a lot. And so we need to look at it from the point of view of this was written in 1506. And we can't look at it necessarily with 2026 lens. We have to take a look at it in the context.
Now, to follow the question there, the one that you have under the background summary, the context at the top, you have Castiglione is a reliable source regarding court life because now, since it is early in the year and you think this is 4th or 5th day or a little after that, somewhere around that kind of window there in the Renaissance, do you talk to kids, especially since this is their first ever AP class for a lot of them? Do you ever ask them as a scaffolding way, if you have time, what is reliable? Like, what makes a source reliable? What does it actually mean? Because to me, that's something I would ask because they would see a name like Baldassare Castiglione and be wondering, like, okay, who is this guy? Like, who is he, and what is it about him that makes him a reliable source on one way or another? Because sometimes I like purposely giving students a source that is not. And let me give you an example on that anti-Semitism DBQ that I shared with you about a month ago. I did a Holocaust DBQ this for Unit 8. I purposely found a passage from a Russian propaganda like newspaper or secret agent or something like that. And it was a forged document. It was a forged document that was anti-Semitic, and it was released to like the public. So then I didn't say anything to the kids either. Like they've been trained naturally to kind of always look at source lines and whatnot. And I would say it didn't take long at all for the class to start raising their hand and calling me over. It'd be like, Mr. Malcolmson, do you know what this says forger? Do you know what that means? I go, well, yeah, I made it. Like, what do you think that means? So it's one of those things where, like, sometimes I like to give them documents that are seemingly flawed in a credible way. And then I might ask them, okay, so, well, let's look at who made this here. Well, we don't have an author's name, but we have an organization that belongs to a country also known to have anti-Semitic problems. It's not just, hey, here's a German reference again. This was a common anti-Semitic problem throughout Europe and into Asia as well too. So for me, that's one of those things where I know it's a long way of asking you whenever do you ever have that conversation with them early on, is because your claim is that he is a reliable source because of this. Do you first preface the students and say, well, what is a reliable source in general? Then we can go into talking about why him. Why is his source reliable?
Well, let's go back to the fight in the lunchroom, right, Robbie?
Yeah, there you go. It's a good spot.
Okay, so all right. So there was a fight in the cafeteria at your school. Okay, but what about a fight in the cafeteria at the school in the other county? Okay, so now once people start talking about the fight in the cafeteria that they weren't at, so you keep coming back to that original story, and all year long you can keep referencing that fight in the lunchroom. And again, it takes less than 20 seconds, and you're back to they can. AP Euro is hard because there's not that many hooks in our brain for the kids to hang stuff on. I mean, it's neither Holy nor Roman nor an empire. I mean, seriously, these poor
like
kids.
what is that?
Yeah, and so these poor kids. So if you can keep going back to, okay, guys, let's remember what we said about the fight in the lunchroom. Okay, now let's talk about who was reliable. Is the recording liable, or is somebody who spray painted about the fight in the bathroom locker? Bathroom stall, which one is going to be a more reliable source? Which one has more credible information? And so keep referencing that. And so again, flipped classroom, the textbook I use has a solid 2 paragraphs, which is a lot of information on Castiglione, the courtier, book of the courtier, and role expectations. I also provide here my own little excerpt of him, and that he was a diplomat. He was papal nuncio. So I explained that he was the Pope's representative at the court. And so we read this out loud, and they see that this guy has been in 3 different courts. Okay, so if he's been in 3 different courts, is he a reliable source about life in the court? And they'll say, oh, obviously, yeah, he's been there. And then I'll go ahead and I'll, flip it around and say, am I a good source for, and then I'll name, some type of music genre or film genre, and and say, okay, I don't like horror films, so would I be a good person to critique a Texas Chainsaw Massacre? No, because I've literally never seen the movie. So, yeah. So you want to, again, have that reference. So for me, I keep referencing the burglar activity that I did at my institutes, that I do with my students. And so the kids can go back to that, and I can talk about an immediate cause, a long-term cause, an immediate effect, a long-term effect. And yeah.
Yeah, and those are all really good. And again, you do a great job, again, like you said earlier in the show, about you have that paragraph at the top that you said, I think you read that with them in a way. Before they even start to read the primary source, they're already discussing, in a way, they're doing like a very detailed source line. And they're getting the luxury of seeing quite the detailed description here. And they're getting that before they even kind of dive in. And I assume at this point, the kids understand the culture of the Renaissance in like at least a generalized way before kind of getting into this. But given like who he was in his background, it is a great way of hitting on that point of view and why that's so important in this as well. And it's great. And again, another way you also brought up again about not doing the thinking for them. And again, too, you could read that with them, ask a question like that, and allow them to list off the reasons for you. They can list off reasons on why he is a reliable source, which is already getting them used to listing.
Yeah.
That then allows them to do the end of the assignment so much more effectively. Because look, you just did it with other evidence for the context part. Now do it from what the person actually says in their thing. And here's something else too, is that you brought this up in the context of like suburban America today. Like me and you live in kind of I live in a rural, like conservative kind of suburban area, not extremely diverse, but obviously still pretty strongly swayed into like second wave feminism and things like that. So what happens if you have like students that are like I can see some students getting offended, like female students getting offended by, I guess, the sort of oppressive way to kind of hold women to like a feminine standard. But it's just one of those things, again, where as a history teacher, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine if you're like offended, if you feel that way, but let's talk about it. Let's talk about why you're feeling that way. That's a great way to learn a historical skill of why context matters. So let's go back and look at that 1506, and has first wave feminism started yet? Mary Wollstonecraft is not until much later, all that kind of stuff. So it's like you said, I almost look at it as a strategy called unraveling. Like you could take a source like this and unravel it. And like you said, you got short-term, long-term issues, and you could really have a macro discussion about Northern, but especially Italian Renaissance in this way from just this one particular source. Now, just out of curiosity, since this is a lot of your students' first class, and this is one of the first primary sources they see, are they at all intimidated by the length of the paragraph?
Yes, and this, brilliant. I appreciate the lobbing me the softball of a question there, Robbie. But just like we have been told all throughout our teaching career, preview the video, preview the video. Well, for this primary source, let me tell you, everybody out there, you have to read it and then you have to annotate it. I've got mine that says start here, and then it's like 5 words into the second sentence, and I say come to a stop. And then I ask them down there on the bottom, it says, all right, what are 10 role expectations? And I say to the kids, okay, I just read you a sentence and 5 words. All right, what are 1 or 2 role expectations? What are women expected to do or not do based on this? And so again, this idea of you have to preview the source, you as the teacher, you can't throw them into the deep end and say, okay, here, I mean, Castiglione, this thing is like 4 sentences, you know, I mean, it's huge sentences. And so you do have to get the kids to trust you, not only turning to each other, parents share and culture of trust, but that the kids learn to trust you, that here's an intimidating source and I'm going to walk you through it step by step. And so I will read probably like the first, I think I have it scripted out where I read like the first 5 or 6 lines, and then I stop halfway through again. And then I'm like, okay, you guys are on your own. You're going to underline words and phrases. And so, yes, it is intimidating if we allow it to be. But if we are the coach that we need to be, it's not going to be intimidating. And the kids will trust us with the heavy lifting that they're going to continue to do.
And here, I'm not sure how much time it took you to craft this assignment to kind of put it together in the way that you wanted it to be, but it's one of those pieces of advice I have for teachers. I think you gave me this many years ago, is to kind of look at it as a way of building your portfolio as a teacher as the years go. Like, you're not going to create an assignment necessarily like this for every single thing that you do. But if you create something that has a great balance like this is something that may be a great assignment for a decade or 2 decades or something like that. It could constantly, it basically, I guess I would call it would have a chance of aging well.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring this up to you, Ken, because I forgot to share this with you recently, but I'm going to put a link for it in the show notes for the viewers and the listeners. Is the article I really wanted to reference you. The other article that I liked, other than one you referenced earlier, the lies, the damn lies, and like the primary sources, that was a very good article, the one I shared with you before. The one that I told you was a more critical view was this gentleman named Keith Barton. He has this scholarly article on JSTOR. This is Primary Sources in History, Breaking Through the Myths. And his main complaint at the beginning, and this is something I've been guilty of, which is like thrusting primary sources at students with very little to no context, no lecture, no mini lecturing, no kind of thing. And this is one of those times where I feel like your assignment here is another great example of doing what he advises us to do as teachers that would be more effective, a much more effective way of introducing them to using sources with just what you did at the top, like doing just a little bit at the top there and doing a little bit of a maybe 5-minute little background, or like you said, having them read a little bit of the Italian Renaissance the night before in a textbook. There's got to be some kind of foundation for your primary source to kind of set on in a way. And I think that's one of those things with that people like me have become so obsessed with primary sources that sometimes I don't think I scaffold it well, and students often end up very confused, and not the good kind of confused. Like, sometimes I like when they're confused because they can work things out. But then I think I've also put my students in positions sometimes to be confused where they're not really getting across the skills or the content what they really need to know. But I've done a good job of finding really good primary sources to use. But looking back, it didn't really achieve what it was really meant to achieve in the moment. And I need to do better at that. And it just shows you, like, 18 years in, I'm still making mistakes like that. This is the reason why I want to have these conversations with you and read these kind of articles, because then I could easily like recalibrate and work on that. Now, hey, did you want to show off the back page? I forgot to go to that earlier.
So I do Castiglione, role expectations for men, role expectations for women, do that way back at the beginning of the school year. And then we revisit it. We revisit, I think we did this like 3 or 4 class periods ago, where I familiarize them with Castiglione, the courtier. We reread that, they re-highlight role expectations for women. And then there's a digital archive out there of all the Life magazines. Now, we happen to have a family in the town that gave us all of their Life magazines from the 1950s all the way to about 1972. And so we've got well over 300 Life magazines that I just tell the kids, okay, go out and grab 2 from the 1950s and let the pictures speak for themselves, let the ads speak for themselves. And of course, I have to say, okay, this is back in the days when doctors recommended cigarettes and things like that. But then, we take a look at to me, the big line from Castiglione is, a woman who lacks beauty lacks much. And then I say, let's take a look at Life magazines. And so the kids, they're having fun. They're flipping through and they're seeing all of these fun things. And I'm saying, take a look at the ads. Which ones are in color? Who are they made for? And they'll see that a lot of those ads aren't geared towards women, but it is a woman who lacks beauty, lacks a lot. So the kids all come to the conclusion of women's role expectations are the same. It's just the technology has changed.
Yep.
And it's almost, I don't know if the word upsetting is right. But then again, I show them that this accident of birth, you weren't born in 1506, you weren't born in 1954. Here we are in 2026. So what can you do to take advantage of where you are right now, young ladies? And boys, how can you then manage how you interact with with your female classmates and things? So I like, again, this whole idea of relevancy. And then also the fact that we're doing this in April allows us to go back and do a review from way back in August.
Yeah, it's a great idea. And is that another piece of advice you would have for teachers that are using primary sources predominantly like me? Like, I use secondary sources, but I try to find as many primary as I can. And that's a theme I've heard throughout the show tonight, is relevancy. So for you, that works greatly. But I would definitely think if your intended audience is a teenage-based audience, like the way you and I are, relevancy is not going to hurt, especially if you're trying to use a document not only from the 20th century, but imagine using it from the 15th or 16th centuries. It just seems so detached. And I feel like assignments like this, it can kind of show students that things are not as far back and distant as they seem. And you could probably even find some modern day, or at least some 21st century references that are probably not far off from even the 1950s and 60s one, depending on what kind of source you have. But this is excellent. Like, I really
and then again, it's role expectations. So we got some content, but then you've got the skill of, let's compare. So what's the same? Let's contrast. What has changed? So the big one for all history, whether it's American, whether it's on level, is continuity and change over time. All right. What has stayed the same? What has changed? But okay, kids, why?
Yeah. Again, do not forget and overlook the word why. And I think that's where often the pacing again comes back in, and it prevents some of us, or I guess I would say it peer pressures some of us not to spend as much time as we probably should on something, is because we're worried if we spend too much time on the why, we're not going to have all the content done. But I don't think that, like you said earlier, I don't think it's smart to ever overlook the why and why that is so important, and how that can kind of carry on, especially when you're learning these skills like continuity and change, which is a prevalent skill through the entire school year. And I would say, again, helping a student think like a historian. Well, if you go back to your career opportunities in geography and history, I don't think thinking like a historian would ever hurt you in any other career. Like, I don't even care if you're an influencer. Like, the number one career goal of most freshmen in our school is to be a social media like influencer. I could even say, well, thinking like a historian is not going to hurt you on those endeavors either. So I think that's great to do. If you're okay, I'll go ahead and move on to the next topic here. I know we looked at students and teachers here. This one, it says, are primary sources ever misleading for students if they do not have enough context? Again, we could skip this one if you want, only because you and I have hit on this, like, straight into the show. But if you have anything of utility to add, please, by all means, go for it.
Can you put up the Boxer Rebellion magazine?
Absolutely. I'll put that right up now.
Okay. So primary sources will always be misinterpreted, be misleading if the kids don't have the context. And that's why they pay us the big bucks as teachers, is to give the kids that context. All right. So if I show the kids this picture, they're like, oh, there's a bunch of Chinese people building a railroad. Okay, so let's go ahead and start working on, when do you ever build a railroad over a hole in the ground? So let's go ahead and does anybody have a hammer that is moving something down, or does everything seem to be being lifted up? Right. And so, I mean, even just looking at the pictures, the kids don't get it. And then now we start getting into what is the context. And then even though this is in French, pretty much every kid in the room can understand petite means little, Parisian means something, you know, and so then we start breaking this down. And so without the context of knowing the Boxer Rebellion, and then again, this idea of I have to get the kids to a particular place. And so I'm asking them, where is the hyperbole? Where is the exaggeration? Is this published in France? Is it published in China? And those types of things, unless I'm giving them, I mean, seriously, there's like so many layers of context. There's a historical context, but then just the context of how do you understand the format of this image of the Boxer Rebellion tearing up a railroad track with the train coming down in the back and the station being on fire. There are so many layers of the context that without the teacher's help, the kids will misinterpret every primary source.
Yeah. And again, the sources, like you said earlier, sources are always going to be, they show a lot. They also don't show a lot. They're going to have their limitations. Even from an artistic piece here, you're limited by the perspective that's taken by the illustrator on this as well too. But to eventually to get a student to connect this to colonialism and to like France being involved over in Asia, and how does this connect back to, like you said, you do yours in a different order, but how can this connect back way back to even in the age of exploration time period, all the way up into the 1800s and forward? Because I think if you can understand this later, it only makes it a little bit, I think, somewhat easier to understand like the topic of decolonization in units like Unit 9. When you get to Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh later, you can kind of, it's a very similar sort of logic there. And again, I like this. It's and again, you're not asking them necessarily to write a ton here. Like you give them these spaces where it's more, it looks like more almost like a brainstorming assignment. Like they can answer with bullet points. And maybe that's where you kind of get to, and just tell, you're really just trying to get them to think here. It's not really a writing assignment, but you are working on topics that you can write about later. Again, contextualization, intending, again, too, and all these other things. It's very good, but I can definitely see how this can be taken out of context. And I've never seen this particular source before. I do use Le Petit in class, but I've never seen this exact one from the Boxer Rebellion. This is really interesting. So that's a good point. Again, I'll go back to that question there as well, too. Again, is that a common mistake I'm sorry, that was one we already did earlier. Wait, maybe I did do this one using the mistake. Okay, maybe I skipped over one. Is that what I did? Yeah, there it is. I did skip over one. I'm sorry, Ken. So the one that we're doing right now is misleading. There's another one that still goes along with this one, and I don't know if it still works for this one or not. I'd be interested when it comes to the topic of over-interpreting. I love at the beginning you said, list what you see, no conclusions. Because I think sometimes the kids are so used to their freshman year with me, it's like CER, like claim evidence reason, and they love inferring. And again, we love for students to infer, but this is one of those times at the very beginning, you're very clear. I don't want you inferring anything yet. Like just show me it is. So I feel like for me, I think over-interpreting can come from over-inferencing. And I don't know if you would agree with that or not. And that's a skill that we like, but I guess how can you often tell as an experienced teacher when a student is attempting to or has over-interpreted a document?
For me, I kind of think it's when they over generalize a document.
Okay.
I think they over interpret when they think that one document, one source, therefore means all of society feels that particular way. And so I think it behooves us as the teacher to make sure that we are providing multiple sources. Now, that Boxer Rebellion, I do have a written source of Boxer Rebellion notices, and then I've got the illustration. And again, do notice this is responses to imperialism. So this is, we're in, what, March when we're doing this. And so I'm still in March telling the kids, list what you see, no conclusions, explain the context of the Boxer Rebellion. Where is the hyperbole? Where's the exaggeration? And so this idea of how to think like a historian, I need to be reminded how to think like a historian. There's no way that a 15-year-old who's trying to make number 2 doubles tennis is going to remember how to think like a historian,
Yes.
So I have to help the kids. I have to help guide them. And so for me, I got to and then I have to also be listening all the time to make sure that they're not taking my one source and saying that applies to everything. And then again, I have the kids, they have their textbooks, and I'll say, okay, let's flip it open and let's take a look at, here is a quick primary source that I think it was something about like the Russian ambassador saying to like the British delegate about the Boxer Rebellion. And then we've got this. So, okay, now there are 2 sides to the Boxer Rebellion. Now the classroom teacher, feel a bit more comfortable that they do understand that there are 2 sides.
Again, I completely agree, especially whenever we're rightfully encouraged to show different perspectives. And I think I've had some questions from teachers concerned about this before because, DEI has its merits, like having more diversity and inclusion with terms of content sources. And then sometimes, especially with the earlier content at the beginning of the year, you and I and other teachers are limited. Like, let's just say if you're trying to show like a female perspective, a male, of that too. And I might get a teacher that asks me sometimes, well, I can't really find one of this one. I'm kind of concerned about that. I don't have enough perspectives. And I go, well, it's okay. Diversity can mean multiple things. Don't think that a diversity has to just mean gender or sex of like an audience. But like you said there, look at the pro and con or the sides or the multiple sides of like the Crimean War, not just like a Russian perspective, but these other ones as well too. But also like I love the Unit 6 with like the social reform movements, all the different isms. I always call them the isms that come in there as well too. Is that Flora Tristan is not the spokesperson for all socialists. If I remember correctly, is she utopian? I'm trying to remember if she's a utopian socialist or she just might be a socialist reformer. I can't remember if she's on a.
Remember.
Yeah, I don't think so. But it's one of those things where, again, I always try to be careful with students that we're seeing 2 different sides here. It doesn't necessarily mean that they speak for everybody or the majority of people in that society, but we just have to always be cognizant of that and be aware of that. And again, it's the fact that we're trying to teach history and also skills at the same time. So we're kind of hindered by the limited scope. So I think as long as we're aware that we never outright say to students, hey, this is the end all to be all of how everybody thought back then, I think you're ethically in a good window there. I want to show another question. We're almost done here, Ken, with our podcast. I want to show this question because I don't know if you and I have already done this. This is towards the end. We have one more after this, but it says, are primary sources ever misleading for students if they do not have enough context? So the reason why I'm asking you if was this enough here is that I think that you might have already sort of established an idea of what could be enough. Like you gave us a good example of this one from Castiglione. I think it's over here. For example, a little bit of context there at the beginning, or like earlier in the show, you mentioned about maybe a 5-minute lecture or some kind of mini lesson, maybe a reading the night before. I guess, do you think that is suffice enough to answer a question like this? Or is there anything else that you might have prepared for before this conversation that you wanted to add to it?
All teachers are confined by time.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea how you do 35 minutes. I've got 90 minutes every other day, usually, and I can't get it done. So we have to learn that instead of a hour-long lecture, if we need to get through the information, we might have to take that hour, cut it down to a half an hour so that we can have a half an hour of a gift of time for something else. And so, yes, things are misleading to students, which is why we as teachers need to make sure that we are setting the stage for them. We've got to get the playing field ready. We've got to get the yard markers out there. We've got to get the water bottles filled, got to make sure the programs are printed, and then the kids can come out and play the football game. And as such, that's what we need to do, is we need to provide that context, short amount of time, let's go.
And again, I agree. And again, especially given if you're listening as a teacher, like you said, your time hinderment is kind of unique for you. So wherever it is that you're teaching at, you just have to kind of find what works for you. It's another reason why I've always appreciated, along with many things, on how you train teachers, because you have a lot of flexibility in the way you train, because you're not giving people exactly pacing wise, exactly how long you should spend here or there. I think you're very careful to kind of say what works for us in our unique situation we're in. We find a way to make that work. And I appreciate that about you. Our last question of the night is going to focus still on maybe a little bit more of the skill side of this. We know that all sources are biased, even secondary sources, because we're human. We all have biases that we have. But how can a biased source, maybe even one as particularly as like propaganda, for example, because a lot of our teachers that might be listening to this are either finishing Unit 8 or finishing Unit 9. You know, with the Cold War, World War II, there's lots and lots of propaganda to look at. But even if if you go back to Castiglione or anybody else, how can a biased source still be valuable to historians? Now, if it's easier for you to answer this in terms of students as the intended audience, go for it, because I know that's our thing. But even historians or history enthusiasts like you and I, we still love history, even though we also teach it. How can that be valuable for us, even though they have their biased sort of faults to them?
Go ahead and put back up the Reformation pictures,
Sure.
Bobby.
Right here.
There you have it. Yes, propaganda is valuable. All right, so it's hyperbole. And I should have provided in advance some other ones for propaganda. I like what you're saying now about post-Cold War, or excuse me, Cold War is what we're doing right now. And so, yeah, have something in there about how do we look at the Soviets and how do the Soviets look at us in regards to propaganda. And so to me, if you are showing, and this is how it works for me, it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. How it works for me is, let's go ahead and put up both sides. Let's put up the caricature of the papacy as the devil, and let's go ahead and put an image up there of Luther holding the hand of the devil. Okay, so let's go ahead and understand the propaganda on both sides, and now let's start delving into what is it that was upsetting people so much to make them come to this exaggeration. And then I think that we can now use propaganda to strip away and get to, hopefully, the historical context of what made the author, the artist, produce what they did.
And it's a great way of tying in multiple topics. And that's the thing, even with the biased source, you're able to bring in indulgences here, the onset of the process of Reformation, the printing press again. Like you could collaborate an assignment like this. I mean, look at your guiding question at the top, or the compelling one. How did the new technology of the printing press aid in the spread of Reformation ideas? This, ironically, without me even reading that earlier, it goes really well with that map. It was on one of the old AP exams back in the day, that map of where the printing press centers were across Europe. You could use that in conjunction with this and have an even greater, you can have a geographic conversation about this as well too. And I think that's what I love about being a history teacher so much, is that you and I have this flexibility to kind of pick and choose, what we want to be able to use to kind of convey like a bigger story here. And I think that's what it's the challenge, but it's also the beauty of the beast. I think also to think of it too is to be able to have that. And I think that's a great way to look at it. lots of things in history, we see this, but especially in terms of like media, and in terms of relevancy, it's another great way to say, I know propaganda, like I ask the kids all the time, do we still see propaganda today? Do we see misinformation? It just looks different now. Like you said earlier about the 1950s and 60s magazine, social media is used as that weapon now of information, misinformation. Look at someone like me that's a military historian trying to follow the Iran war as it's being fought is one of the most confusing online experiences. Me and my friends that are other history teachers, I've talked to you a little bit about too. It's so hard, not just day to day, but hourly, to follow the narrative and what's the U.S. and Iran and other countries. What are they exaggerating? What are they telling the truth on? What are they using as a decoy to mislead the public or the enemy in other ways? Because you don't want to outright. It's weird though. It's a weird dichotomy because from their position, you don't want to give away the truth of everything you're going to do. Like, we're going to attack Karg Island. That's exactly what we're going to do. Why would we announce that? Like, why would that be announced that, hey, here comes D-Day. Here's when it's going to come. So it's one of those things where it's interesting to bring that up. But even in a pop culture references of how one of my team teachers, she actually uses, back when this was more of a thing, but time has changed so much. But do you remember when Kanye West got in trouble several years ago about his anti-Semitic tweets that he had? So one of my teachers, she'll bring that in as a way to introduce propaganda and how quickly like things could be taken in context or out of context, and what could that have an effect on your POV? Like, how could that affect your credibility? And if you think about it, Kanye West has never really been the same in terms of popularity since a lot of that started. And again, there's other things too, but there's so many things like in terms of modern day relevancy or near modern day that you can give to students and tie it back to the 1500s or 1600s or around the Cold War and still bring that up today. It's just so fascinating to kind of bring that up. While you were sharing your answer earlier, Ken, to kind of finish up here, I did want to remind listeners, if you're not a video watcher, if you're just on the Spotify or the Apple podcast, is that Ken did an episode with me a year and a half or a little bit more ago in which we covered his life and his career and his experience as an AP teacher, giving AP teachers advice. Feel free to go back and listen to that. You don't have to listen to it before this one. You can still get pure value out of that, but it's one of those things you kind of get. And the book link one. What do you want me to reference there, Ken?
Oh, it's just you. I heard you and Mr. North talking about it the other day.
Yes, so sorry. I thought you might have sent me something you want to do, but you're right. Okay, so I do want to bring that up too. I'm so glad you brought that up. Is that Charles North VI, the battlefield vlogger that I had on the last episode or 2 episodes ago, and I'm going to have again on with this series, and he's going to give his argument on primary sources being so damn good from his perspective, especially when it comes to like physical like evidence. Like I think you would agree too, Ken, those articles I sent you, if you have the ability to hand students a physical object, even better. Like how great is it for kids to pass around and hold something like that? But it's harder for me and you who teach European history to have necessarily that luxury sometimes, but I think it's cool. But he recommended a website from a bookstore in New Jersey called Secondhand Books. I did go after that last episode. I checked out their store. I really liked it. They're not sponsoring me or nothing like that, but I liked it. I just ordered The History of Torture, which I would love to do a series on in the future. And maybe I'll invite Ken back to some really good torture history and European history.
I went to the Torture Museum in Rothenburg.
Excellent. You can share that with us. So maybe that's the next time I bring you back. Is after this series, I'm going to probably do a series on either the plague or on torture. I would love to do the plague with you someday too, Kim, because that's not something that you and I necessarily have the luxury to teach in AP Euro, because we start like right after the decline of the plague. But often I'll use the plague as context to set up the transition into the Renaissance. And you have to admit, nothing gets the kids' attention more than like death. Show things like death and its symbolism. It's a really good hook at the beginning of the year to kind of bring that in. So Ken, to finish up the show today, again, we did about an hour and a half. Is there anything that you want to leave the viewers or the listeners with in terms of, I guess, in a grand scope of things, if we go back to our very core question of the entire episode, and again, this is the series, why are primary sources so damn good? Is there anything else you would like to add to that? Anything you would like to say to the listeners before we part ways again? And hopefully not taking a year and a half before we talk to each other again.
Exactly. Students and teachers, don't be afraid. Baby steps, start small, work your way up, do it incrementally, find some good guiding questions, find some sources that you are comfortable, particularly as teachers in your classroom, what works for you. And there are things that work very well for me with who I am as a person and my experiences, my baggage, my story that I have, that think particular primary sources work better for me than for others. Comparison is the robber of joy. So just because I do things you shouldn't feel bad. Let me tell you, every time Robbie puts something out there about this is the Socratic seminar I just did, I just have to take a deep breath and say, I do that in my other classes. I can't do that in AP. That's not how I teach AP. And what works for me in AP works for me in AP. What works for Robbie in AP works with him. So yeah, make it your own.
Well, I appreciate that, Ken, and I appreciate you investing your time. I know what you brought up there reminded me about the multiple choice Mondays that I do, and I started that a year and a half ago. And I mainly did it because, for me personally, my writing results, how we see our results as a class, like when they have done very well. Based on the data, where my classes are struggling at is really the multiple choice section. I never forget the first time I met you, I asked you, do you have any strategies on multiple choice? And you said to me, I think I remember this, and I'm going to paraphrase it. You said, when you find some, just let me know. You're basically admitting that throughout your career, like most of us, and this is something that I ran into, and one of the reasons why I started the podcast is that not a lot of teachers, other than maybe Mr. Heimler and Emily Poole and some others online, they have these strategies for doing multiple choice. For me this year, I write a lot more on a regular basis in class with composition books now and things like that, even SAQs. But I've also focused now, I dedicate at least one day a week to just practicing analyzing multiple choice. Like do a source, secondary, primary, here's four. Try the Heimler method, read the source line, get rid of the two like terrible answer choices and find the distractor, find which one's right. And basically, it's not just answering them and turning it in. It's literally wrestling with it and then doing a class discussion over why is it those? Why are these wrong? Like in context of the year. So it's one of those things where I have to kind of naturally build that process in. But it's like you said, you have to kind of do what works for you. And you've always been careful with me. When I found something that you did that was really good, you were always careful to say to me, just remember that comparison is a thief of joy. If this works really well for you, do it. But you always told me to give myself some grace and some credit. There are things that I'm doing really well. And like the Socratic seminar stuff, the last big one I did earlier in the year about absolutism and constitutionalism, I got a ton of good feedback from people on Facebook. It really surprised me and kind of caught me off guard. But another cool experience of that was a couple of people that I met made a copy of my lesson and added more to it, or it changed some things that made it even better. And then now I'm using what they did. I recycled, edited work of my own work that someone else did. And this is kind of why I've always liked the beg, borrow, and steal kind of moniker that they have in public education that we have. So Ken, again, I appreciate your comment. Your support has always been very meaningful for me. And I think teachers like you, anybody that I've ever talked to, which is probably at least over 20 that have had you in trainings before, always speak extremely highly of you. And I think for good reason. I think our listeners, whether you're a teacher or not, even if you're a history enthusiast, I think you're going to come away from this episode with even more of an appreciation for primary sources. And Ken, I'm going to make sure to share with you that critical source. It's not a long article. It's just 4 pages. But I would love for you to see what his myths are, his 7 myths of how we misuse primary sources, and then his 3 solutions. I think they're very interesting. I'm going to I shared those on episode 1 of the series that you can go back and listen to. And again, I'll list those out from him. And I think that we could all find moments where we are guilty of some of those myths. And I like some of his solutions and stuff. So Ken, thanks again for everything. I thank all of our listeners for your time and listening to the podcast or watch us on YouTube. But as always, keep questioning the past in order to understand the present and be contagious.